Welcome. Joining us today is Dr. Stephen Wykstra, Professor of Philosophy Emeritus from Calvin College, where he's just retired from 31 years of service. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Trent.
Steve, you mentioned that as a teenager, the death of your father led to a sort of spiritual crisis. Can you talk about that a little bit?
You know, I should say I'm first. Just can I preface my answer with this? That as I realized last night when you told me we had this interview, I must have missed an email from you on this, and I'm really glad I missed it because I would have been really nervous if I'd known earlier an interview was coming up. And you're a really quick on your feet kind of guy, and I'm sometimes not quick on my feet. You know, there may be times I'll just sit here for 15 seconds or so. And
hey, we can edit that out. We'll play a short cartoon like they did in the old movie.
Okay. Yeah.
We'll cut to Mickey Mouse really quick for a while.
Okay. But that way you guys don't have to be nervous about that either. So, so the death of my father, I drifted or defected away from Christian faith after the death of my father and the couple of years after that. And it's, you know, these things, it's hard to know causality. But a couple of things come to mind. My dad died very suddenly on a Sunday morning, December 15th, 1963. And I would have been halfway through 9th grade at that time. We went to church in the morning. I had two sisters at that time, Nancy older, Beth 3 years younger, and Nancy remembers Dad skipping to church with Beth. The church was a tiny little village, Martin, Michigan, one stoplight, 500 people total. Skipped to church with Beth and then came home, and I was upstairs changing my clothes, and I came downstairs and Nancy said, Mom took Dad to the doctor's office. He wasn't feeling well. This is kind of a long way into your question, but it was a sudden death. Mom came back a half hour later, said, children, come here, and gathered us and said, your dad's died, passed, gone. And
it's a very hard age to hear that.
It's a hard age. It's a hard age. At, if I was probably 13, 14 then, you're still working through stuff with your dad at that point. I remember in the aftermath of that, my mom's official line was, not my will, but thine be done, oh God. So it was a really attempt to be submissive to that, but she went through a long period of depression. I think, you know, who knows really what the stages of grief are. They vary so much, but maybe there was repressed anger against God or something. She went through a long period of numbness, as she would describe it, after that. And I remember sitting on the front porch of my Aunt Mina, lived 3/4 of a mile south of town, farmhouse, sitting on the front steps, talking with her. And some things that you just remember, and I remember her startledness. I said, you know, I think my mom loved my dad too much. And she said, why do you think that, Steve? And I said, because nobody should be shattered so much when somebody dies. So in the years after that, I had a big attraction to, in English, after I started migrating away from Christianity, probably about age 15, I had a big attraction to Eastern religion that one of my high school teachers, my favorite teacher, Mr. Meek, said, why don't you try reading some Taoism? And I read Taoism, and then a sort of Buddhist, Hindu, Vedantic Hinduism.
Do you think he thought Taoism would be therapeutic, the idea of just accepting what happens?
I don't think he was thinking of my father's death at that point. I think he just sensed that I had a kind of religious hunger, and that the small town Christianity I was raised in wasn't working for me, and that there was windows into transcendence in some of these other traditions. I think he might have been kind of a Huston Smith, religions of man type person. And but the Eastern religion, part of what attracted me is the detachment theme, that it's a theme, suffering comes from attachment. And so cultivating a detachment from, meant you wouldn't be shattered when bad things happen. So what was the question you asked me?
To discuss this.
The effect of the death of my son. Yeah. So I think that made Eastern religions attractive, and then Mr. Meek also exposed me like to Jack Kerouac and the Dharma Bums and that Beat Generation right here. Man, you're just primed for that growing up in a little town of 500 people, and you're exposed to that literature. That was very powerful. Plus there was Route 66. Todd and Buzz travel in their Corvette around the U.S., and you guys don't know Route 66, do you? The na 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 na. I can even remember the theme song to it. That's a kind of detachment too, you know. So I'm kind of just babbling on here. But
so where did that take you? I mean, did you pursue that, or did you just read a few books and move on, or did you pursue that line?
Yeah, I pursued that. Of course, Timothy Leary was in the air, and so I read the Alan Watts and the psychedelic literature, and the idea that you could maybe alter or tweak your brain chemistry that way, and kind of open the doors of perception. Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception I read.
Did you attempt to open
your
doors of perception?
While I was still in Martin, my cousin and Mark supervised a night of considerable stomach excess when I ingested morning glory seeds, which were supposed to be, I think they do contain psychoactive chemicals, but they put poison in them too, I think, to keep that. And it has to be the right kind of morning glory seeds. Pearly Gates or Heavenly Blue are the varieties. So, yeah, and there's an end to this story that I hope, I don't want to glorify this period of my life, but then after I graduated, I ended up in New York City in the Lower East Side, East Village. That was the summer of 1967, the summer of love.
You were in the center of it all.
I was, yeah. So I took LSD 3 times that summer in maybe a 5 or 6 week period.
When the doors of perception were opened, what did you see?
I didn't see, at that time, when I finished that, I thought, this isn't what I'm looking for, that this is just changing the way things appear. LSD, it's extremely intense, and one of my senses while I was on it is, I'm still me while I'm on it, but sort of more so, because everything gains a certain intensity. And then for part of the biggest trip I had, I was sitting, it was late at night, and I was sitting on a door stoop, and East Village at that point was tenement houses with hippie crash pads here and there. And I found myself descending into this rather hellish, even the colors, these murky, swampy greens and blues, in a hellish area of your deepest fears about yourself, and accusers. So it was like I was, and I sort of mythologized. I didn't mean to be talking about, I haven't told anybody about this, I don't think, my whole life. So it was like a descent into hell, and I think I kind of mythologized it to myself. Okay, I have to do this descent into hell and face these things in order to come back up, metamorphize as it were. And I don't think I would have come up except a voice broke through, a young woman's voice saying, "Are you tripping? Are you tripping?" And I came out of it, and there was this young woman who realized I was in a bad trip. And she said, come to my apartment. And she said, my boyfriend will be back soon.
They can help you.
So So, geez, I shouldn't be talking about this stuff. I've never talked about it.
Talk about whatever you want to talk about.
Well, you just brought me into it, man. So, anyway, so I went up and she said, have you ever done space talking? And I said, no, what's that? And she said, well, we lie like spoons and then you just listen to me talk. And so we did. And there was nothing erotic about it, at least not too much erotic about it. And I knew her boyfriend was coming back. But she wove a spell with words, and it brought me up into a orangey, nice, pleasant, glowy place. And I remember, in as much as one remembers these things, I mean, there is that saying, if you remember 1967, you weren't really there. But I do remember. And I said, well, I was exploring a different place. And so I started talking to her and bringing us down to that dark green place. And she said, no, we don't want to go there. And so she brought me back up. And so I had somebody who intervened in the trip who knew chemical voyages and got me through it, got me out of a bad trip.
But it sounds like the fundamental conclusion of this experiment was...
The fundamental conclusion was that this isn't really a road to where I'm looking for. And what the deepest sense I had after 5 weeks or whatever it was there was that when people weren't tripping, they were really, really bored. They were looking for their next trip. And I asked somebody, and there was a little group of serious psychedelic explorers there that I lived with for a while, and I said, so they said, we're really close. That means really close to knowing, you know. You'd sort of look around at people and you'd say, do you know? You'd be looking for somebody who knows with a capital. It was like this complete kind of wacky place, spiritually wacky place to be in, where you, and they said, we're really close. And I said, how many times have you dropped acid? And they said, I don't know, maybe 300, 400. That's a lot of LSD to be ingesting. And the lives were just, they were bored when they weren't tripping, except looking forward to the next time, to trying to get closer to whatever it was. And so I hitchhiked back to Michigan, and did I tell this last night or at lunch? One of the two times. But I was hitchhiking back, and maybe it was July, late July of 1967, and a guy picked me up taking the main highway across, and the guy dropped me off the highway so the road shoots straight up to Kalamazoo and then to Martin, where I grew up, and he was this recent high school graduate, kind of an athletic type, a jock as it were, and he witnessed to me and said my life is really, was really messed up. I never did drugs, but a lot of ways athletes can get themselves messed up, and I asked Jesus into my life, and things have really been changing, and maybe you should do that. And so during that whole time, I had a New Testament with me, but I was reconstruing Jesus as someone who had one of these nirvanic experiences, who then taught, you know, the kingdom of heaven is within you, la-da-da. And that the church had just misunderstood who he really was. The apostles, they didn't really get it, you know. And by the end of that summer, I felt, no, they're not the one. I don't know who Jesus is, but I'm no longer so sure they misunderstood him, and I'm pretty sure the Timothy Leary isn't getting him right. And so I prayed for the first time in a number of years alongside that road, and it was a little highway. When I was at Notre Dame, I drove back up that highway, and it's still there, a little two-lane road just north of Constantine. Isn't that interesting? It's north of the town Constantine, and said, asked Jesus to show me who he really was, and said I was sorry for doing whatever I did to my brain through those LSD trips, and come into my life somehow? And that guy, this is the thing, that the guy told me, this is kind of a radical thought. He said, you don't have to invite Christ all the way into your life. Just invite him as far as you're able, and he'll come that far, and he'll work with you, and he'll make himself, you know, further into your house. And that's kind of what I needed to hear, because I couldn't just swallow the whole package. I'd spent years, you know, being skeptical about the whole great truths of the gospel, the virgin birth, the resurrection, the miracle stories. You're not going to buy a whole package like that. And Jesus' disciples didn't. I mean, they didn't start off following Jesus around because he said, I'm going to die for your sins. And it was a discovery.
It was an encounter with the man himself. It was an encounter
with a person who, and the mysteries revealed themselves gradually. So I was thinking, last night I was sort of thinking about a different rubric for thinking about apologetics. You know, Al presents the great truths of the gospel as this kind of package deal. And I was contrasting that with a passage in Dietrich Bonhoeffer that struck me that I in Letters and Papers from Prison, where he's talking about Karl Barth. And he said, Barth began a certain really important movement for the church, but he was a positivist. He treated it as all or nothing. You have the whole package. And I thought, that's not how it's going to work for a lot of us who are on a journey. I thought of a title, Epistemics for the Journey. I don't know if epistemics is a legitimate term, but it had the right kind of color to it.
This is philosophy. We can make whatever terms we want.
Yeah, that's right. You can just make them up. So I want to, as I come back, you know, your invitation, it led me to come back to this 2002 essay I wrote. And, but I wasn't so much thinking then of epistemics for the journey, but I think it fits with that. And that's what I want to be thinking more about. How for people who have drifted away from the church, I mean, some come back into it whole hog, and that's great. But some that doesn't work. How do you seize upon, and I'm struck by Romans, I think it's 10:9 or 9:10. If you confess Jesus as Lord with your lips and believe God raised him from the dead in your heart, you will be saved. You know, I like that it doesn't lay the whole package deal at once. So
it's a long ways from the side of the road there in Michiana to history and philosophy PhD in one of the leading institutions in the country. How did you get? So it's clear that you plumbed the depths of one certain path and realized that it was a dead end, that it was a cul-de-sac.
Yeah, yeah.
But that just leaves you on that road with a wing and a prayer, quite literally.
Yeah, yeah.
So how did you get onto philosophy?
Yeah, so I went to Hope College in the fall of '67, and there was a kind of a charismatic philosophy teacher there, D. Ivan Dykstra. And so, and he, you know, I was always looking for a guru, right? And he had that persona. He looked like a person who knew, you know? And so I was very attracted to him, just out of my old fleshly nature, so to speak. My old psychedelized fleshly nature. And so, and he exposed me to real philosophy. You know, I didn't know there was a tradition of philosophical reflection, you know, going back to Plato, Descartes, all the way up. He had an intro course that I was in right away, and so that opened the door to philosophy for me. Before my psychedelic period, my passion, my first love was chemistry from 5th grade to 10th grade. And I started as a chemistry major at Hope, but soon became attracted to philosophy. I was still really confused. I dropped out of Hope and thought I had a mission to go back to the hippies and bring the gospel to them. And I dropped out partly to go there and partly to go, this shows how messed up I was, but I was still attracted to these kind of Gnostic-y kind of movements. And there was one based around Edgar Cayce. And there was an organization in Olympia, Washington, the Organization of Awareness, where you could sort of channel the universal spirit that Edgar Cayce, if you guys don't know.
And it's like hovering around the earth, right? I mean, like,
yeah,
he located it in the stratosphere.
It's the cosmic consciousness. Yeah. Edgar Cayce was a Baptist minister who would go into these, in Virginia Beach, and he would go into these trances, and then he would do psychic readings where he'd tune into the cosmic awareness. You know about?
We don't do that at Baylor.
Yeah.
Just to be perfectly clear.
So the long and short of it is, I was really confused, and at emotional levels as well. And I had a great pastor who had befriended me in Martin, Pastor Beckering. And of course my mom she was at wit's end. She had no idea what to do with this son. And he said, Steve, maybe you'd find it helpful to go to Pine Rest for a while. Maybe that would open some doors to you. Pine Rest Psychiatric Hospital, it's a Christian.
Sounded like, I mean, I've never heard of it, but
yeah.
Pine Rest sounds like a place you actually don't necessarily want to go.
No, it's a great Christian psychiatric institution in Grand Rapids. And
does it still exist?
Yeah, it does, yeah. And I thought, okay, I'll go there because my mom really needs me to. And they'll see that I'm really, really in tune with truth, and and that'll be helpful to my mom. And then I can go back on my hitchhiking. So after 3 days there, they weren't getting it. And so I went to the desk and I said, okay, I'd like to check myself out now. And they said, no, you can't do that. I said, I checked myself in. It doesn't matter. I was like Ken Kesey, you know, and they said the doctor has to release you. Oh. And about that time, a police car pulled up and brought another guy in who tried to
who had checked himself out.
Yeah, yeah. So I was in for an adventure at Pine Rest for about 6 weeks probably. Wow. And I had a great therapist, Bill Lenters, and he helped me get back to just being a confused 17-year-old guy, you know, who didn't know how to talk to girls but wanted to, and had constructed a whole identity for himself as a little Siddhartha searcher, and then that kind of dropped away.
So how old then were you when you went to New York the first time?
It was right after my high school graduation, so I think I probably turned 18 in August 5th, 1967. So I must have been 18 then. I just turned 18, yeah. So Pine Rest really helped me to get back to just wrestling with the things that all 17, 18-year-old guys need to wrestle with, and not having this big smoke screen around a spiritual smoke screen over myself. And then I went back to Hope the spring term, and I'd be in Lenter's office, and he'd say, okay, Steve, there's the phone. I want you to call up a girl for a date.
We also don't do this at Baylor.
He felt this was important for me, you know. And I said, Bill, I'll do it when I promise I'll do it. He said, okay, I'm going to be checking on you next week. So I did. I started like calling up girls. I'd fall in love with them right at the first date, you know, and they ditched me because I was such a needy 17-year-old, you know. Cute, huh? But then I started studying. Steve, you're entertained, aren't you? And so I started studying philosophy, and then had some really good teachers, and then I read Thomas Kuhn, and D. Ivan had me lead discussion groups on Thomas Kuhn. I don't think it was the spring term, but the next year. So he got me involved as a kind of assistant, and then I realized I wanted to go into history and philosophy of science, and labored my way through a physics major, added as a second major, took an extra term semester to do that, so I went through in 5 years. Met a wonderful young woman in English class named Ann Larson, and we met in a little discussion group on Goethe's Faust, and I'd been reading Carl Gustav Jung on Faust. So she was really impressed with me, and so we would go for walks and fell in love, and she's my wife now.
I've met her. She's very delightful.
Yeah. So.
So that gets you to college. That gets you
through college,
through college.
and then it puts me on that path to history and philosophy of
now,
science.
what was your faith doing, and where was your theology about that time? As you're heading to this graduate program, where's your head theologically? Yeah,
so it had made a sudden turn the year before because in the first part of At Hope, I was reading quite a bit of Paul Tillich and Rudolf Bultmann and also Thomas Merton, kind of the mystical tradition in the 20th century theology, and I hadn't yet been exposed really to what you could call intellectually vigorous evangelical theology. And then my wife and I enrolled in a summer training program in evangelism and Christian growth in East Lansing under Tom Stark, minister at University Reformed Church there. And so I was with a group of 30 men and women, young men and women there for that summer, and we would read Francis Schaeffer and C.S. Lewis and John Warwick Montgomery and Clark Pinnock, a little book by Clark Pinnock, Set Forth Your Case, and F.F. Bruce, the New Testament documents, Are They Reliable? And those were really helpful to me, F.F. Bruce in particular. And so I came to see that there was a intellectual undergirding for what you'd call mere Christianity, standard Christianity. And that summer, I came to believe in a real resurrection of Jesus.
As opposed to more like a symbolic interpretation.
As opposed to a symbolic one, yeah. And as I said last night, that marked a kind of switch in my heart as well, because I think up until then I had still felt that, I mentioned this last night, that Merton in his book, Zen and the Birds of Appetite, I mean, Merton really tried to explore the Eastern spiritualities along with his sort of Trappist spirituality, including Zen. And he had a poem, a Zen poem, Ride your horse along the edge of the sword, hide yourself in the middle of the flames. Blossoms of the fruit tree will bloom in the fire. The sun rises in the evening. And that is that sort of descent into kind of authenticity in the darkness to let rise up something new, a kind of phoenix from the pit. And that's very much a self-made resurrection, I think. At least it was for me. And it also is a kind of ethics of authenticity that can be quite narcissistic and self-absorbed. And for me, believing God really did raise Jesus from the dead, the Father raised Jesus from the dead, was a shift to a kind of spirituality of realizing it's all dependent upon God's power and God's grace. We have a role in that too, but it's not a remaking of oneself by some whatever type of act, you know, that you think is going to do it. So I still traveled light theologically, and I probably still do travel light theologically, but a belief in a real resurrection of Jesus has been a kind of anchor for me. And then some increasing And I think an affirmation of what the tradition holds, even about Jesus, even when I don't really see very clearly what sense it makes. So there was a period there after that. So I entered a kind of evangelical Christianity through the back door, through that summer in East Lansing. Still traveling pretty lightly. First year at Pitt, when I went to Pittsburgh, I lived in a Quaker meeting house there in Oakland, and I was attracted to the Quaker approach. But more conservative Quaker, Elton Trueblood, was important for me at that point. He had a book, The New Man for Our Time. Yeah, the title wouldn't be PC anymore, but it's a good book. And then increasingly, so Quakerism is kind of was for me kind of a stepping stone. But then gradually through the church we went to, and I would go out to R.C. Sproul's study center, Ligonier Valley Study Center, which was in Pennsylvania before it moved to Florida. And I loved R.C. Sproul. I just loved sitting and listening to him lecture. And he had gab fests Wednesday night where there'd be a huge group of people in his living room and he'd answer questions. Very charismatic, reformed, hardcore reformed thinker. Super hardcore smoker too. I mean, he and Vesta, like they'd go through a pack or two of cigarettes every night. He no longer smokes, but so I encountered Reformed thought through R.C. Sproul again, and discovered the attractions of a strong Calvinist position, which I don't know if to some level I identify with that, and at other levels I travel pretty light on that stuff.
Well, certainly, I mean, Sproul and some people to the right of Sproul practice what's sometimes called presuppositional apologetics. And that's very different from the kind of F.F. Bruce, Clark Pinnock approach, where you're setting forth your case is very different than, just trying to find the contradiction at the heart of the other person.
Right, that's right. I don't think Sproul was a presuppositionalist. I think he was, he and R.C. and Gerstner, John Gerstner, who was his mentor, I think were much more.
I mean, they did have a critique of Van Til's like hardcore presuppositionalism.
Yeah.
They still strike me as more rearguard than your, what you call sensible evidentialism.
Maybe.
Can you give us just the 30,000-foot view of what is use this phrase sensible evidentialist? I'm definitely an evidentialist. I don't know how sensible I am, but I'm certainly a hardcore evidentialist. What is a sensible evidentialist?
Well, it's still morphing. It's still evolving. But
what is the gist, the parameters? What's the banner?
Well, I guess the first and most important thing, at least chronologically, is a realization that the things that do need evidence, in the sense of inferential evidence, in the sense of some sort of inferential case from it might be a pretty diverse pool of data that if you think of it in abductive terms, inference to the explanation. The type of inference is an explanatory inference where you've got diverse data and you're trying to find the best hypothesis that makes sense of them, or you're trying to evaluate the rival hypotheses. And that's something that can happen sort of intuitively. I think John Henry Newman talks about I've never said this word before, illeative sense, which is sort of our instinctive ability to do this inferential sizing up of things. Or you can be done in a highly self-conscious way using, Bayes' theorem or Minimax type inferences where you're trying to use rules to do it. But the sensible evidentialist holds that it's a communitarian evidentialism. So it holds that in some way the health of your belief or of my beliefs for things that need evidence And not everything needs this sort of inferential evidence. I don't need it to know you're sitting next to me, okay? I don't need any abductive inference for that. But some things do need it. And those that do, your belief and my belief on those things is very much dependent upon being part of a community and a tradition where other members in that tradition are doing what they need to be doing in doing some of that hard inferential work. So things that need evidence, if you're a sensible evidentialist and you think belief in Jesus' resurrection needs evidence, it doesn't mean that you have to know all that evidence and be able to make the case. But it means that if the community is epistemically healthy, some people with the relevant training and the relevant expertise need to be doing that part of the work of the Christian community.
That sounds sensible indeed, but don't I need some evidence that they have the evidence? I mean, if they're just doing it in a back room or in the church basement, and I don't even know they exist, then it's hard to see how I really am in a community with them in the right sort of way.
Yeah, you have to be, whether you need to have that evidence or not will be very dependent upon you, on who you are. I mean, there is if we're talking about your being well-functioning cognitively as a responsible epistemic agent, it's going to depend on whether you're 6 years old or whether you're 60 years old, and a lot of other things, how much you need to know about that belief and that part of the community that's processing. So I would say for a kind of well-educated, mature Christian believer, yeah, probably so. Probably at least to have the maximum virtue intellectually, to be manifesting the virtues that I would say God wants you to have as a mature Christian. You should know that there's F.F. Bruce. You should know something about the work of J.B. Lightfoot and repelling the Tübingen critics in 1890. You probably don't know that, but it's a good thing he did that work, and your health also depends upon that stuff you don't know about, but if you looked into it, you would find out about it. Really important, I think, realizations on this have come in the work of, for instance, Bill Alston's essay, Epistemic Desiderata, and Plantinga rehearses these, that in terms of our cognitive health, our epistemic well-being, the report card doesn't have just one grade on it. There's a whole bunch of different things that can go well or can go poorly in our intellectual operations. And you can't just say there's one, whether you're rational or whether you're justified in belief. There's a bunch of different virtues, and each one, and they kind of interact with each other. Mm-hmm. But to simplify, each one has its own line on the report card. So I would say some of those lines on the report card, yes, it's important for you to know that for things that do need evidence, that there's people in the community who work hard on those things. Maybe there's other things on the report card, like, I know you're not an externalist, but if you were one and you thought there was such a thing as warrant, and it was primarily based on whether the process actually has gone objectively right, that links your belief about the resurrection to what actually happened in 30 AD, and it's gone right by virtue of the right sort of testimonial transmission. Whether your belief has that warrant, that objective warrant, might depend on its going right, even in the years, 60 AD, where the testimony was getting more from some sort of oral transmission into written form, having gone right at that stage. It may depend upon its having gone right at that stage, and you're having no idea how that right went or what right amounts to.
I mean, that's something that any internalist can accommodate, because I can say that
Yeah, you promised me that yesterday afternoon.
Yeah.
We were going to talk about that at dinner, and we never did.
The food was too good.
We talked about demons instead. But I thought it was because you changed your mind on it.
Not a bit.
I didn't want to press you on that.
Not
I
a
thought
bit.
you'd be like embarrassed.
I will go on record right now on film. No externalism in this guy whatsoever. Well, Steve, I appreciate you sharing with us today so candidly and giving us sort of the biography behind the ideas. And there's a lot of wisdom in there and a lot of food for thought. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Trent.
Thank you.